Okay, let's begin with a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for your self-revelation in the Bible. We thank you that you have revealed yourself to us in all your glory and all your grace. And we ask that you would help us to be on an ongoing and fearless search to know you better and to be more submissive and in harmony with your will for our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. This evening we're talking about wisdom literature, and I find it's a very interesting topic. I think it's not it's not one of the best known parts of the Old Testament, and yet wisdom literature had a certain function in Israel that should be familiar to us. Traditional societies in particular, and our society at one time, I don't think it's so true anymore, but our society at one time, I think what you could call wisdom was passed down from generation to generation. And it was done in different ways, but one of the ways had to do with Proverbs. And some of these you will know, some of them you won't, because it was very specific to. I've got one that's very specific to my family, but other proverbs that were common at one time in our society that you may recognize: a stitch in time saves nine. A penny saved is a penny earned. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Notice a lot of those are pre-industrial. Or one that came from Ben Franklin: early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. In my family, sometimes I have joked about it. One of my mom's saying was, "It's a great life if you don't weaken." Um, a very positive kind of saying. But recently, I asked two youth ministers if, if those kinds of proverbs or any sort of proverbs were the things that their kids did, the kids in their youth group, and they said no. And they said, in fact, if we were to teach the kids biblical proverbs, they would not remember them the next week. And so I think something has happened that we're not, and I think it's a sad thing in the culture that, and I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope the youth ministers were wrong about it, but I suspect that the wisdom of the past, what generations previously have learned, and it's not just the past generation, but it would be the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. That these things traditionally were handed down from generation to generation, and they were based in what people had learned over the long haul, and they pass on this knowledge or this wisdom to the next generation. Well, that's sort of a context for wisdom literature. In ancient Israel, certain things were passed down from generation to generation, and we have some of those things written down in the wisdom literature of Israel. The Bible, in a broad sense, reflects both human and divine wisdom. There is human wisdom, and this would be the sort of wisdom that I've been talking about, where it's passed down from generation to generation. It is what the previous generations found to be true. to be solid. It is the way Proverbs, by their very nature, I think, say the way things usually work. They're not ironclad, and sometimes they've been taken that way, especially the biblical ones, that it always works out that way in every situation, in every generation. And that's not necessarily so. It's the way things usually work. For a lot of Proverbs, both in and out of the Bible, you can find exceptions. But I think that's just the nature of Proverbs. But there are human Proverbs. The human Proverbs, some of those are human wisdom, rather, not just Proverbs, but human wisdom. Some of that is helpful, and some of that's this passing down of the understanding of the way things are from generation to generation. But some of it is, and some of it's positive, some of it's neutral, some of it is downright evil. Sometimes people, we talk about somebody being worldly wise. There are people who know how to make money by any means. There are people who know how to acquire and to hold on power by any means. Those are not positive, but it is a kind of worldly or human wisdom in that sense. In some cases, we might call it street smarts, but people can be very clever. And I'll have more to say about that later, but and that is reflected in the Bible. Sometimes there are people who are described as being wise who do evil things in the Bible. One of the sons of David ended up raping his half-sister, and it was on the advice of his crafty, even wise, in a human sense, friend. Or at another point, after that brother was murdered by another brother by the name of Absalom, David, who should have handled the situation before Absalom got to it, but he then blows up and exiles Absalom. Well, he then mopes around because he has exiled Absalom. Joab, the army commander, is disturbed by David's moping around, and so he hires a woman who is called a wise woman to convince David to bring Absalom out of exile, and she does, with bad consequences. So human wisdom isn't always that wise. Somewhat in contrast to that, you've got human wisdom and you've got divine wisdom. Divine wisdom is the wisdom that comes from God, or it is wisdom that is based on God and on the principles that he put into creation. Wisdom in the book of Proverbs was said to be there when everything was created. And so wisdom is part of God's good creation, or it's not created in the same sense that the earth is created, but it's enmeshed in the way things really are. And so there's a component of it that it is in harmony with nature because God created nature. And at certain points, he reveals his wisdom to people. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. There's both human and divine wisdom, and in the wisdom literature of Israel, we have God's divine wisdom. Also, something to keep in mind: while God is the ultimate source of true wisdom, in the Bible, Solomon was considered the human standard for godly wisdom. Now, I can hear people objecting, Solomon didn't always do the wisest things, and that's absolutely true. He started out well when God asked him at the beginning of his kingship God said he would grant Solomon anything he wanted, and Solomon asked for wisdom, a wise request, and maybe perhaps the wisest thing that he ever did. But he becomes a standard for wisdom in biblical literature. His deeds, his wise deeds, especially early on in his reign, are well known, and he was said to have written proverbs and songs, and that he had a vast knowledge of nature, and all of that ties into this. It's also interesting to me that of the four books that are considered wisdom literature, at least by some people, the four that I consider wisdom literature, and we'll be talking about some this evening: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Songs. Of those four, three of them, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, came from Solomon. We don't know about Job. For all I know, Job came from Solomon too, but we wouldn't know that. But the others all come from Solomon. So wisdom in Israel is very much associated with Solomon, and he is considered a key figure in Old Testament wisdom. Okay, with that brief introduction, I want to look at principles of wisdom. Number one, principles of interpreting wisdom, more specifically. Principles of interpreting wisdom. Number one, understand the purpose of the wisdom books. Number one, understand the purpose of the wisdom books. Someone said, I think it came from Fee and Stewart, but when I went back, I didn't find it there. But someone said that most of the Old Testament emphasizes the imperatives: believe and obey. But the wisdom literature stresses think. So in the Old Testament, you've got, believe in God, believe he has the power, believe he is in ultimate control, obey his will, obey his word, obey his commands. But wisdom literature then says think. Think about God, think about life, think about the deeper issues of life. Wisdom literature, the basis for wisdom literature is the fear of the Lord, and that is stated in Proverbs 7 or 1 verse 7, which is the theme statement for Proverbs. It comes right after the first 6 verses, which lay out the purpose of Proverbs and give us insight into why it was written and why the things are included in it that are included. But then we've got verse 7 where Solomon says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of knowledge. There are certain words in Proverbs that are used synonymously, more or less, and wisdom, knowledge, insight, those kinds of things are all used pretty much interchangeably in Proverbs. And so the writer is letting us know from the very beginning that Proverbs is a kind of practical theology for daily godly living in a complicated world. And we will have more to say about the fear of the Lord as one of the keys, or the key to wisdom later on. Wisdom, biblical wisdom, is a combination of both knowledge and character. and it allows someone to live in the world in a right and godly way. The goal of wisdom, I think the goal of all wisdom, but we'll see it more specifically when it comes to Proverbs, but the goal of all wisdom is to develop character. It's important to keep that in mind. Character development is what wisdom is all about in the Bible. This takes thought, it takes observation, it takes discernment. Wisdom literature uses the imperatives: listen, look, think, reflect, uses that kind of language. So understand the purpose of the wisdom books, which is to develop character. Number 2, understand the context of each book of the wisdom books. Understand the context of each book of the wisdom books. Broadly, and this is, of course, we could spend a whole semester and more studying each one of these, but just in brief, I want to talk about the four books that are included in our catalog of wisdom literature. First of these is Proverbs. Proverbs provides what we could call practical wisdom. It presents a basic approach to life. It is rational. It is orderly. It tells you the way things work best. Sets out principles that are normally true. And it would make sense that God, who is orderly and rational, would be behind a wisdom that's orderly and rational. And so there are all sorts of principles here for daily life of the individual, for life in the family, for work, for treatment of friends and enemies and people who are disadvantaged. It says to be diligent, to work hard and you'll succeed, but if you're lazy, you'll fail. And so there's a broad range of practical advice that Proverbs gives about how someone who's developing the kind of godly character that's envisioned in Proverbs will be living that out in the real world. It's important to note here that the advice is in Proverbs, and there are these two things that are part of this. It is both practical and godly. Practical and godly. Worldly wisdom will be practical, but it won't be godly. There are some people who are very godly but aren't very practical. But Proverbs has both godliness and it's practical at the same time. So focusing on this practical godly wisdom is important in dealing with Proverbs. A second book of wisdom literature is Job. While Proverbs presents practical wisdom, Job has what we might call speculative wisdom. Job deals with, on a high level, with a big sweeping problem in the world. It deals with what happens when things don't fit with the orderly, rational world that we live in. Some events are easy enough to explain. Some events are impossible to explain. And we are forced to simply trust the Creator. I believe in Proverbs, or in Job rather. Job is what should I say, is a long and somewhat difficult and even confusing search for an answer to the question of suffering. Now, I think there's something, I have actually come to the conclusion that there's something more important in Job than the discussion of suffering itself, although suffering is a big issue. Because what you have in Job is you have a narrative at the beginning, or an introduction, which it sets out the main characters, and tells of Job and that he is blameless and he fears God. God himself says this about him. But then there is this kind of contest that takes place, in a sense, between God and Satan, and God allows everything that Job has to be taken away from him. There's the introduction. In the conclusion, basically everything comes back to him again. But in between, we have this dialogue primarily between Job and three friends of his. A fourth one comes in later, and then later yet, God comes in and has his own discussion with Job. But most of the book is taken up in these rounds of dialogue, where each of Job's friends will speak, and Job will respond to each of them. And there's round after round, until, as I said, there's this younger guy who comes in later in the book and has something to say, and then later still God steps in. But their discussion centers on Job's suffering and the fact that he lost everything. And Job's friends have a very simple, straightforward view of suffering, and every evidence in here that was exactly Job's view before it happened to him. And when it happened to him, he got puzzled about what was going on. But the friend's view is very simple. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. It's just the way God set things up. If you're a good person, God will take care of you. He will bless you. He will make you rich. He will give you a great family. Good things happen to good people. But bad things happen to bad people. Everything falls apart. Finances are a mess, and so on. Job then, of course, becomes a kind of test case for this theology of the friends.
Didn't Job believe that too, Jim? I mean, Job actually believed that too as well, didn't he?
I think he believed it before everything happened to him. Because when it happened to him, I believe that's when he started questioning what was going on, because good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to Job, and yet Job will defend his righteousness. And it wasn't just bragging, because we know from the introduction that God says he was blameless and so on. So I believe he had believed what the three friends did, but it was chipped away at, and I think it had begun to fall apart in the face of reality when he saw it happening to him, and it didn't fit the picture. Now the friends made it fit. What they said was, Job, we always thought you were really good, but all this suffering you're enduring makes it obvious to us that you're not that good. In fact, God should have done worse to you than he did. I mean, they're really at times very harsh, and I think he had agreed with them, but I think part of the dialogue, part of the back and forth was he begins seeing that it no longer fits. That is my understanding of it. But I think there's another theme here that is easy to miss. And I've come to believe that it's actually more at the heart of what the book is about than even suffering. That suffering is kind of a test case for the second theme. And the second theme is found throughout, but there's a especially important passage in Job chapter 28. Job 28 appears in the midst of a defense that Job makes of himself and his integrity. At first glance, it looks like that this is part of the defense, although it doesn't fit. It simply doesn't fit with the rest of what he's saying in the defense. It's an outlier. And I believe that it's probably a case where the one telling the story, whoever that may be, steps from behind the curtain, in effect, and makes a speech. But even if it's part of Job's speech, I still contend that this is a key to understanding the intent and this major theme of Job. So in chapter 28, let's see, do I have time to read it? I don't want to run out of time, but I think I can. Well, I'll summarize part of it and I'll read part of it. In Job 28, the writer says that he speaks of the ingenuity of human beings. And he specifically talks about how human beings have figured out how to go down into the earth to get copper and iron and other precious metals. They go down deep into the earth, and he has this picture of the workman hanging down inside of the caverns of the earth and swaying back and forth as they work to get these precious metals out of the earth. And they have gone down to an area where there are no birds. The lion doesn't go there. It shows a lot of ingenuity. But having said that, how ingenious people are, and we could use other illustrations. I mean, if we wanted to talk about the internet and electronics and other things that people do that are ingenious, we could give all kinds of illustrations in addition to what he gives here. But then starting in verse 12, listen to him. But where shall wisdom be found? As ingenious, in other words, as ingenious as people are in going down into the earth and pulling out these precious things, he says, but where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be bought with gold, and silver cannot be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir. in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold and glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of crystal. The price of wisdom is above pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. But where then does wisdom come? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all the living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the sun, under the heavens. And he gave the wind its weight and apportioned the waters by measure. When he made a decree for the rain and a way for the lightning of the thunder. Then he saw it and declared it. He established it and searched it out and said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and turn away from evil is understanding. As ingenious as people are, if left to themselves, human beings will not find the ultimate wisdom of God. God alone knows this wisdom. People, as I said, people can be very ingenious, and there are a lot of things we can do. We have creative power, but finding the ultimate wisdom of God is not one of them, if it's just left to us. And so the conclusion of this passage is, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So it is in relationship to God, and we'll have more to say about this later, but it's in relationship to God that we learn real wisdom. And I've come to the conclusion that the real issue in Job is not simply suffering, as big an issue as that is, and that is truly an important issue, but that the deeper issue is, where is wisdom found? Where is the wisdom that understands suffering? Where is the wisdom that understands everything in a turbulent world in crisis? How do you understand these things, and how do you understand the way human beings are and what they should be doing? And that ultimately comes from God. But anyway, Job is speculative wisdom, and those are the sorts of things it deals with. Then we've got Ecclesiastes. It is also speculative wisdom. Ecclesiastes is an intellectual search for the meaning of life and the ultimate good in life. And how do I want to put it? It is both. Well, I'll put it, I'm going to say it's both optimistic and pessimistic, both positive and negative. Commentators seem to be pretty much evenly divided on this point. Is the writer a cynic, or is he, as another writer said, a preacher of joy? Which is he? And my conclusion is that he's both, and that we actually need to keep those two things, hold those two things in tension. And because there's both the positive and the negative in Ecclesiastes, and both what seems to be optimistic and what is pessimistic at the same time in Ecclesiastes. And I mean, for instance, the writer says it's better to be wise than foolish, but even wisdom fails in the search for the meaning of life. So wisdom is better, but even the writer says even that will fail you. And so it is Ecclesiastes is not an easy book to read, but it deals with this high level, deeper issues having to do with the meaning of life and the ultimate good in life. And he discounts so much of what people think is the ultimate good in life or the meaning of life. And then at the very end of the book, he gives us the key to understanding meaning and ultimate good. I was just going to read the last two verses, but I think I'll start. This is chapter 12, starting with verse 9. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly, as he wrote, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed in the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Amen. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment and every secret thing, whether good or evil. So in the end, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, when everything's been heard, everything's been done, the most important thing is to fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. There's the ultimate good. And that's where we get ultimate meaning. The fourth book that we'll include in our list of wisdom books is Song of Songs. That's my title for it. It's commonly called Song of Solomon. It is not practical wisdom in the same sense as Proverbs, or speculative wisdom in the same sense as Job and Ecclesiastes. It's what I will call marital wisdom. Proverbs gives good, practical, wise advice on marriage. It's not the only thing it talks about, but it does talk about marriage quite a bit. However, it's difficult to build a great relationship in marriage on logic and rational thought alone. Song of Songs celebrates the wild, sometimes irrational aspects of true love. In Proverbs, you have husband and wife in the marketplace, quiet, discerning, hardworking people. But once the lights go out and in the privacy of their home, they need to be the crazy, madly in love, slightly irrational couple of the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs was difficult for the rabbis to get their minds around. Their problem was that they understood it, And in understanding it, they said that cannot be part of the Bible, because as Julius Boer said, no one would misunderstand the Song of Songs and that it's love poetry if it wasn't in the Bible. And so for the rabbis, the problem was a group of love songs simply can't be part of the Bible. So what are we going to do? On some level, they knew that it belonged there, but they have trouble believing that it belonged there in its obvious meaning. So the clever rabbis decided that it was an allegory. It was about God and Israel. God's the husband, Israel's the wife, and this love between them is God's love for Israel. Then when the church started, they sort of, the early Christians, some of them at least, took over the interpretation of the rabbis and said, no, it's not God and Israel, it's Christ and the church. The problem I have with that is, going back to Julius Boer, anybody just picking up Song of Songs and reading it, while some of the images there are different from images we would use in love poetry, it's obvious that that's what this is. And so I believe the way to interpret it is as either one. Some people say it's one long love song, and some say it's a whole series of them. Whatever it is it's a picture of two people who are madly in love. They describe each other. They speak lovingly to each other. And there's also a chorus that comes in every once in a while to entertain us and to add certain things. But in that sense, there's a kind of flow of the book and showing the kind of love that God, the kind of pure love that God had in mind when he created human beings and put them together in marriage. And our culture very much needs Song of Songs and its understanding of this in marriage, because our culture unfortunately has bought the idea that passionate love is out for outside of marriage, and that once you get married, all the passion, all the passion of love goes away, and that somehow before marriage or outside of marriage in some way is better, and it's not. And Song of Songs reminds us of that. Okay.
Of all the Jim,
Yeah.
of all the things that disrupted a congregation that I was preaching for, it was a total complete interest in Bible classes and the young married couples studying the Song of Solomon. It was taking a church through the Song of Solomon is very difficult. Little old ladies kind of have trouble with that. The young people really dig it, and the adults just sort of sit back and smile. You know, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy.
Well, and the rabbis used to say that young men should not read the Song of Songs before they're 30. So it's pretty strong stuff, but it's worth doing. I mean, it's in our Bibles. God is telling us something in this book about marital love, and it's to our own detriment if we ignore it. Okay. That was number 2, understand the context of each of the wisdom books. Number 3, recognize that most wisdom literature is poetry. Recognize that most wisdom literature is poetry. As I've already said, except for a brief introduction and conclusion, all those dialogues in Job are poetry. Ecclesiastes is poetry, at least mainly so. Song of Songs is poetry. Proverbs, while it's not poetry per se, it has a poetic element to it that we've talked about before. The parallelism that we talked about, that's the same pattern that we see it in the, for instance, in the Psalms, and then we also see it in Proverbs. So it's important to recognize that and go back to the class material on poetry, and much of that will apply to the way you interpret things in the wisdom literature. And also remember that Hebrew poetry is very figurative, symbolic, a lot of strong images, poetic images. And if we get bogged down in how literal they are, we'll miss a lot. Okay, that's number 3. Recognize that most wisdom literature is poetry. Number 4, read wisdom literature within the context of the book that it's in. Read wisdom literature within the context of the book it is in. I'm making this different from what I said earlier about the purpose of the books. It's just see the wisdom literature. How do I want to put it? It's important to keep them within the book and not simply rip them out from it. And I'll have some illustrations of this. One illustration is just the book of Proverbs. You can take individual proverbs out, but it's also important to see them within the context of the book. There are certain themes, Proverbs, which has a different kind of structure, and in fact, some people probably think it doesn't have any structure at all. It's just this list of proverbs, but there actually is structure there. And well, I'll give some illustrations of that. Proverbs 11. We'll be looking at two passages here. Proverbs 11. Notice verses 16 and 17. See, we could take each one of these verses, simply take it out of its context, but it's best to keep them together, and you'll see what I'm talking about. A gracious woman gets honor, and a violent man, and violent men get riches. A man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. Notice the pattern here. A gracious woman and a kind man are parallel to each other, as are violent men and a cruel man are parallel to each other. The gracious woman and the kind man are positive images. The violent men and a cruel man are negative. And notice the gracious woman gets honor, and they lived in a society in which it was an honor and shame culture, and it was better. Honor is what you wanted. Honor as an individual, honor for your family, honor for your village, honor for your your clan, honor for your country. I mean, honor was so important, and it was literally better to be dead. It was literally better to die than to bring shame on yourself or your family or your clan or so on. And the gracious woman gets honor. Notice the contrast. I find this interesting. Violent men get riches. I think it wouldn't be far off if we added the word only. Violent men only get riches. They don't get honor. A kind man benefits himself. That's not why he's being kind, but his kindness in the end will come back on him, because God, well, like the woman giving her honor, he will be benefited by his own kindness. But a cruel man, although he doesn't realize that, a cruel man will hurt himself. So see, keeping those together brings out the meaning more. And also, there are times in Proverbs when this kind of pattern that we see here is in a larger section. But a little farther on in the chapter, notice verses 23 through 27. We could look at each one of these verses. I mean, each one of these could be pulled out as a separate proverb. But notice what happens when we take them together. 23 through 27. The desire of the righteous ends only in good. The expectation of the wicked in wrath. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and the one who waters will himself be watered. The people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. Whoever diligently seeks good seeks favor, but evil comes to him who searches for it. Okay, I want you to notice the word good. The word good appears in verse 23 and 27. 23 says that the desire of the righteous ends in good for himself. 27 says that whoever diligently seeks good seeks favor. It would be favor from God. And in both cases, this is contrasted with the wicked or with evil people who get the very opposite of the good. And these are like brackets around verses 23 through 27. This idea of good and receiving good. And if you will notice in 24, 25, and 26, all of those proverbs have to do with generosity. So the person who seeks good, it seems to be implied in this, the person who seeks good is somebody who will be generous to other people who are in need. So while each of these could be taken as separate proverbs, they get, I think they're even more powerful when you take them together. And there are sometimes there are themes that will run through. Sometimes there are, we'll run through whole sections of the Proverbs. Sometimes there are what are called catchwords, like the word good here. There are some places in Proverbs where there will be a whole series of Proverbs where the same word is used. Or if not the same word, the same idea appears. And I've come to the conclusion that there's much more structure in Proverbs than I realized. And so it's important in Proverbs to see the structure, but also there are themes that run through Proverbs, like here, generosity. These aren't the only places in Proverbs that speak of generosity. And I think the teaching of the Proverbs, you can speak of them individually, but to interpret them, and also there's a certain power in keeping them in the context of the book. And well, I'll give another example of the context of the book. Early on in the book, it speaks of wisdom as it personifies wisdom as a woman. It's a woman who calls out to people to come to her and receive wisdom. That's early on in the book. At the very end of the book, there's chapter 31, the woman whose price is beyond rubies. And it seems a very literal picture, and I think on some level it is. So this wisdom personified as a woman, and this woman in chapter 31 serve as kind of bookends around the entire book of Proverbs. And it is not a coincidence that the woman at the end of the book, in chapter 31, epitomizes the principles that are being taught throughout the book. In a very real sense, the woman in chapter 31 sums up the message of the book. But again, see, keeping those things within context is important. Also, with Job and Song of Songs, the issue is a bit different, but still keeping it within the context of the book is important. In Job and Song of Songs, it's important to keep straight who's speaking. Remember, I said in the heart of the book, in most of the book, you have this dialogue going on between Job and his friends. A lot of what his friends say on one level is correct, but the application they make of it is wrong. So it's important when you're looking at Job to know who's speaking. And even with Job, remember, Job is in the midst of suffering. He's trying to figure out what in the world is going on with this. He's always believed, just like his friends, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. But here he is. He knows, and this is not arrogance, because God himself has pronounced it. We know what neither Job nor his friends know, that God said that Job is blameless and fears him. But Job knows that he was a person of integrity, and he cannot, for the life of him, understand why these bad things happen to him when good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. He's not a bad person. His friends conclude that he really is. They just hadn't realized it, but he really is a bad person. But he knows he's not. He's been a person of integrity. He is a person who has loved and honored and obeyed God, and yet it does not fit with his theology or with the theology of the friends. So it's important to keep everything in the flow of the book so that we're not quoting one of the friends who's off, not quoting them with approval, or that we're not even quoting Job because some of the things he says come out of his anguish and his confusion. And so it's very important to keep it straight who's talking. In Song of Songs, again, it's different from Job, but also in Song of Songs, it's important to know who's speaking. Is it the man? Is it the woman? Is it, for lack of a better term, the chorus? And newer translations will help you out on this. because they they'll have headings that say, say whether it's the man or the woman or the chorus.
Jim,
Yeah.
I think before you get too far down, I think it's important to remember this thing about the bookends in Proverbs is wonderful. And not only that, but it is an acrostic, just like Psalm 119. So in the Psalm 119 thing, when we talk about the acrostic of that, then you have the same phenomenon there, and also in Lamentations. And so it would serve a bookend, like you said, it's a bookend, and this is the complete woman. We've got 22 letters, and everything is covered. We're going to go from beginning to end, from A to Z. She's the wonderful, great woman, and that's just a wonderful way to read that. I don't think a lot of people read Proverbs 31 about the worthy woman and think of it as a bookend, because it is. And it's compared to that woman wisdom. I think one of them called woman wisdom or something like that. They call her woman wisdom, and she's always inviting. And she's compared to the prostitute who is a fool.
Uh-huh.
I think that's another contrast in the book that is marvelous.
Yeah, it is. Good. Thank you. Good point. Okay. I've got 2 more points I want to hit. Interpretation. Here's number 5. Look for the principle within the saying, then think through how it might apply in a variety of situations. Look for the principle within the saying. This is, by the way, especially would have to do with Proverbs, but it does apply to other things as well. Look for the principle within the saying, and then think through how it might be applied in a variety of situations. What was his name? Last name's Long, and I'm indebted to him for saying that that Proverbs, that individual Proverbs just beg for a story. And try that. Look at an individual proverb and think of all the stories you can think, biblical stories or non-biblical stories from your own life. And you'll find there's a lot to be said for that. But this idea of looking for the principle and then seeing how it applies as an example, look at Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, if you're thinking of stories, you might think of a story where either you or someone else either gave a soft answer or gave a harsh answer, and the results of it. So, as far as a story, you might do that. But on another level, within the principle here is that the way we respond to people can either make matters better or they can make them worse. And this can apply in a whole bunch of different settings. It can apply in marriage. Okay, you're in a disagreement, and harshness will, what does he say? Harshness stirs up anger. But don't just think in terms of that. Have you ever been in a store where the person who was where the clerk waiting on you was apparently in a bad mood? Maybe in a surly mood, or maybe it was somebody else in line with you that was in a surly mood. Now with social distancing, we're a little farther apart from each other, and it's hard to be too interactive. but if you've ever had that kind of situation, you know that their being surly could lead you to be the same way, but that's not going to make things better. It just makes it worse. Or or you can give a gentle answer. You can be calm and considerate and kind even when they're not being. Same principle then could be applied to work. It could and work relationships. It could be applied to in your neighborhood with your neighbors. It could be applied to relationship with friends, with enemies. See, the possible applications of this are tremendous, and we can do that over and over again with different proverbs. Okay, number 6. We've already touched on this, but I just want to make the point, based on what we've already said, that the fear of the Lord is the key to wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the key to wisdom. And so to keep that in mind when we are interpreting wisdom literature is very important. We've seen it in Job. In Job chapter 1 and 2. In Job chapter 1 and 2, there are 3 different times when God says that Job was blameless and feared the Lord and turned away from evil. And then later on in chapter 28, which I take to be a key passage in understanding the purpose of Job, he comes back to that idea, and it doesn't specifically speak of Job. He just says that the fear of the Lord is wisdom. So, in other words, what I get from that is Job had the key to wisdom. Even in his struggle, he had the key to wisdom because he feared the Lord. Proverbs 1, verse 7 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and as we saw, knowledge is equivalent to wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, that's a theme, but if you start going through Proverbs, just get out a concordance and look up the word fear, or go to Bible Gateway and type in fear of the Lord, fear of God. It varies a little bit, so a written concordance probably is better. But you'll find that the idea of fearing God is repeated throughout Proverbs. And in Ecclesiastes, after a confusing search for the meaning of life and ultimate good, he comes to the conclusion that the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. The idea of fearing God, some people, I'm sure none of you would, but there are people who I think suspect that the fear of the Lord was something that's relegated to the Old Testament. We needed to be afraid of the God of the Old Testament because he's a bad dude. I mean, just as soon strike you dead as look at you. But he got warm and fuzzy in the New Testament when Jesus came, and we see he becomes kinder and gracious and loving in the New Testament. But the problem, of course, with that is that the idea of the fear of the Lord doesn't stay in the Old Testament. The fear of the Lord also appears in the New Testament. And the love and grace of God in the New Testament also appears in the Old Testament. I mean, the truth is that the God of the Old Testament is the same God in Old Testament and New Testament. And he didn't just learn better or something in the New Testament. And the fear of the Lord, as I understand it, I think it's misunderstood if we think it in terms of some kind of terror, cringing, hiding under a rock. But at the same time, I'm uncomfortable with the term reverence. Because I think that's too weak for it. I would call it ultimate reverence, or ultimate reverence for God. And we need to recognize that when we face the all-holy God, we are facing the one who holds our welfare in this world and the world to come in his hands. And only a fool would not reverence him. Only a fool would not fear him, recognizing that he has all my welfare in this world and the world to come in his hands. We should know that he loves us, that he is kind and he is compassionate, but at the same time, we recognize that he is a God of wrath, and that nobody can play games with God and get away with it. We need to listen to him. We need to reverence him. We need to submit to him, fully recognizing that he loves us, but at the same time recognizing him as the all-holy, all-majestic God who deserves our full commitment and obedience. And I believe that's a key, or the key, really, to understanding wisdom literature. That everything comes from God. It comes for all the good things come from God, and they come for our good. And it is to our detriment if we don't embrace those things and live them out. Okay. That is the thoughts I have on wisdom literature. Comments or questions? If not, then I'm going to have a prayer, and we can talk some following that if anybody has anything you want to talk about. If not, I'm good with that too. Anyway, let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you have revealed your wisdom to us, that your wisdom was part of the created order from the very beginning, and that you put wisdom into books and have given them to us to mold our character, to guide us into being the kind of people that you have always wanted us to be, the kind of people you created us to be. And we ask that you would help us to embrace all that you've given us, and that we will grow and develop and bring honor to you in our behavior. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Good night.